Yeah, I mean, technically by a day, but
Yeah. Cool. Any big plans?
I went to the coast Sunday. Went to
Oh,
Brookings. It was super nice.
oh yeah, I love the coast. Um, yeah, Brookings is nice. It's much better
Yeah,
than
it was like
oh,
56, no wind, no clouds.
cool, cool. Yeah, the Oregon coast is, in my view, the best part of this state. Um, as a non-Oregonian who's lived here for just a few years, I really love it. So that's cool. How's everyone else doing?
Doing much better, feeling good.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Mhm. Yeah.
Cool.
I
Um,
quit caffeine. That's been a big one.
Caffeine?
Today's, I think,
Like caffeine? Oh,
off caffeine. Day
it's,
7.
I could never be done.
Hard. It took me like 4 tries.
Wow. Well, let me know how that goes. That's impressive.
Day 3 headaches, like couldn't believe it. Just my brain itching. But then after like day 5 or 6, the smell of caffeine isn't like draw me. It actually repels me a little bit.
Hmm. Are you doing that for health reasons or?
Yeah, I just been a college student for a little over 2 years now and just staying up late, drinking coffee, doing homework, and my body just can't do it anymore. I can't stay up and all night and do homework. It just, no matter how much caffeine, it doesn't work anymore. So I have to like figure something else out. And yeah, health reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember those days as a student. I don't, I don't necessarily recall them fondly. So I understand the pressures. Uh, all right, so we are closing in on the consummation of this course. Here we are in week 9, and we are officially in the third and final unit of the course where we turn to issues of political, ethical, and social concern. Although I don't like to, at this point of the course, deal in prepackaged contemporary ethical problems for a few reasons. We already have a couple classes that take up that very strategy, such as Philosophy 205, which is moral problems. I teach that as well. So there are other opportunities, as well as moral theory, which my colleague Bois Shapiro teaches. So um, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the class, but there's a sense in which the demarcation between these 3 units, of which the course as a whole is constituted, are rather porous, these boundaries. So in some significant sense, and this will become clear this week, I think, we're sort of coming full circle on the obverse side, as it were, of the question of selfhood or personal identity. So beginning with where the world unfolds, that is, the here of the body and the there of the place in which we find ourselves, opens up a world that we traverse and we can encounter the other. And so that's what we're taking up now, that process of encountering the other, carrying out careful moral political negotiations with lives that are comprehensible, albeit radically different from our own in terms of our background experience, what we take for granted as true, fundamental presuppositions by which we're able to get along in the world as it's presently organized and structured. And so W.E.B. Du Bois will be the focus of this week's conversation. And he is a very important 20th century Black intellectual who did work in a number of thought domains, including, I submit, philosophy. So I certainly recognize Du Bois as an important philosopher of the 20th century, but he's more typically embraced in circles of sociology and perhaps anthropology. He's also a notable writer of fiction, so I encourage you to pick up a copy, a recent version or edition of which has been published by Verso Books, called Dark Water, and that's the collection of stories and reflections from which I take the story The Comet, which was published in 1920, that we'll be reading and discussing for class on Thursday. So he's a writer of fiction as well, and that's an early kind of science fiction story that we'll talk about. And it's really a great story, very powerful. And so let me just look. I had taken a glance at the schedule earlier, a few days ago, but it has now, of course, slipped my mind. But let me just make sure I am clear about who exactly is presenting. Of course, I imagine you know. All right, so it's Alec, that's right, Alec and Liam and Jordan. So you guys are on the schedule to lead discussion this Thursday, focused primarily on the assigned reading of the comment, but making connections as you see appropriate to this week's material, or this day's material as well. So the selection from The Souls of Black Folk from 1903. So Alec, Liam, and Jordan, are there any questions or issues? Are you guys, oops, there's some people trying to get in from the waiting room. Any questions or concerns? Not sure if you guys are here.
Checks out.
Nah, I got no questions or concerns.
Okay, cool. All right. Oh, no problem, Fia. Thanks for joining us. All right. Well, one thing I might do just really quickly is promote the philosophy classes for the spring. I recognize that a number of you have signed up for my philosophy of art class. A few of you have signed up for that. For the spring term, that's going to be really exciting. I'm looking forward to it. But let me just pull up the page with all of the classes that we're offering. So I encourage you to take some courses with my colleagues as well in the philosophy program. Doctors Bois Shapiro and the chair of our program, Prakash Chinjeri. So let me just share the screen in case any of you at this point, looking ahead to the spring, it's getting rather near, are wondering what you should take if you have some openings in your schedule. So let me just pull this up. So let's see, Dr. Shapiro is teaching logic, so introduction to logic. So I'm offering another ethics, moral issues course, but that's going to be asynchronous. So we're not going to have any Zoom meetings as marked by the WWW designation. So I'm teaching philosophy of art, which is an introductory survey course in the history of Western aesthetics. And so that's a synchronous class that will be conducted through Zoom Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1:30 to 3:20. And then Dr. Chinjeri is teaching the third iteration of our three-part History of Philosophy series. So usually I teach the first of the series in the fall, which is ancient philosophy, and then Dr. Shapiro teaches the second course in the series, which is modern philosophy, basically beginning from the 18th century, or rather, excuse me, the 17th century and extending up to the 20th. And then Dr. Chinjeri takes over in the spring and teaches contemporary thought from the late 19th century to the present. And so he's offering that class in the spring, and it'll be a Monday, Wednesday class. And then he also is offering, as he usually does pretty much every term, Philosophy 329, which is science and religion. And I actually taught that for him at one point, just taking up exactly how he organized it when he had to temporarily move over as the interim director of the Honors College. And it was an interesting experience, so I recommend that. And then Dr. Shapiro is also teaching philosophy and sexuality, which meets Tuesdays and Thursday morning. And then Hughes is an adjunct I'm not familiar with, is teaching some topics in political philosophy. So that's just to let you know what we're offering in the philosophy program coming up in the spring. Are there any questions about any of these courses? I might be able to provide some clarification or some details.
They're all great classes. I've done 205, really enjoyed it. Did divorce, sexuality class, philosophy of sexuality. Great class. It's not sexy, but it's interesting. And then healthcare and justice was really interesting as well.
Cool.
So.
Cool. Yes, I'm glad you've taken a few classes with her. Yeah, philosophy 205, I imagine, because the three of us teach that in different ways. So it yields a different experience. I'm teaching 205 right now, and I think I've complained to you all about it before. It's one of the worst classes I've ever taught, to be frank, this term. There's absolutely no participation, but it's all right.
I mean, it's really, for people that just are doing it, you almost need that in person just because it's quite a bit of content and it's a lot to digest and a lot of things being introduced. So if you're not like fully invested into it, it would be hard to kind of keep with it because kind of a lot thrown at you. And I mean, there's only 2 people talking in that class when Deborah taught it, as well as me and one other guy were the only people like raising their hands because it's really weird because it's really engaging class. There's a lot of critical thinking and lots of problem solving. So I recommend it. I think it's a great class. It was really great.
Yeah, I imagine a lot of the hesitancy or reluctance to participate comes from the peculiar sort of controversy of the topics, the extent to which one might fear articulating or giving expression to an unpopular thought. Oh, my office phone is ringing. This is really weird. This is the first time my phone in this office has rang in like 3 years. Hold on a second. Hello, it's Dr. Harmon. No problem. Have a good one. Wrong number.
Funny. I want to add one comment to that. And what you're saying about like it being like some, just interesting topics that will, cause some controversy amongst students. It was wild how many people believe that like you only do things because it makes you feel better, like the egocentric philosophy or ideology. Like they're like, so many people believe that. And then so many people were like believing in the death row all the way, no matter what. I was like, you gotta be kidding me. Like you're talking 1 out of 10 people are innocent and you're full on like, if a judge says yes, kill them. And they're like, yeah, that's how we should do it. I was like, this is crazy.
Yeah. So there are a number of thorny issues and distinctions that aren't exactly naturally grasped by people, given the culture in which we are compelled to develop our capacities and thinking. Yeah. Okay. So, all right. Let's get into this discussion. So, I'm curious how many of you, because of Du Bois's presence in a number of other academic areas and domains, I imagine a number of you are already familiar, at least superficially or to some extent, with Du Boisian concepts or his approach to some problems. But has anyone read The Souls of Black Folk before? Has anyone, without reading Du Bois, has anyone heard of the problem or the concept of double consciousness? Because that's really what we'll be focusing on. So Amanda, you're saying, yeah. So in what kind of classes or in what context were you made familiar with those?
It was USEM 101 with Jamie Hickner. We were doing, it's kind of like a sociology class, really. It was like writing sociology. So we covered just like different Black authors and people for about like a whole term. And so we read, like probably like 8 to 9 different articles on just the contingencies of being in America in a time that it was, hazardous, I guess you could say, and like what resulted from that, and just different trains of thought around it. And yeah, that idea got brought up. We didn't go in depth about it, but basically, yeah, just being a problem and also being American, or being Black and being American, and how those are 2 different things that existed in a single. Was it to oneness? To oneness?
Oh, the two-ness. Right?
Two-ness.
Yeah, good. And Amanda, so you said that you had been familiar with the concept, or yeah, what was the context?
Just, I'm a curious person, and I read.
Okay, so just in your own readings, you came upon it. Yeah, I mean, it's a very influential concept that has insinuated its way into a number of contemporary discourses, and without necessarily calling attention to its point of origin. So a lot of what we'll be doing today is coming to terms with the specificity of that origin, of this line or vector of thought, and placing it in its historical context. Um, and that context is not just historical in the sense of the discipline of history, but also in the sense of intellectual history. Well, we'll be putting Du Bois into connection with other social scientists and other philosophers. Oh, cool. Fia has made a painting based on the concept of duality or double consciousness that she has shared with us. Oh, wow, that's really cool. I just opened it up. It's very striking. Yeah, the colors and just the way the space is taken up. Yeah, that's really nice. Cool, thank you for sharing that, Fia. When did you paint that? Cool, yeah. Did you have any, while you were painting it, was there any explicit or conscious connection to Du Bois or this concept of double consciousness?
Not to Du Bois, but it came from a dream where I was kind of like facing different mindsets I was grappling with, and like different truths that both held ground in me but kind of conflicted. So yeah.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing that. That's really great. Okay, so I want to get us started with a passage. It's on page 8. It's not the beginning. We're really just going to be dealing with the first chapter of this book. But this line comes up and it strikes me as powerfully relevant and disclosive of our present historical moment. So on page 8, he says, "So dawned the time of Sturm and Drang. Storm and stress today rocks our little boat on the mad waters of the world sea. There is within and without the sound of conflict, the burning of body and rending of soul." So that gives expression to Du Bois's the phenomenology, you might say, the concrete dimensions of lived experience that mark the very conditions of possibility for consciousness, that consciousness in which, as I mentioned it earlier, Du Bois is, as an existing individual, opening up to the world from the place of his body, that is a here, opening up to a where, or perhaps also you could say a there, in which he has to encounter other consciousnesses. But at a certain point in his development, those other consciousnesses and the very cultural institutions that outlive every individual concrete existence, that is the persons that make up our society, as well, reflect back to Du Bois a problematic consciousness, which for our purposes in this class, we have already grappled with in other moments. And this was presaged, for example, by our encounter with Hegel through the essay of John Russin. And then a week after that, when we read The Stranger in the Village by James Baldwin. So Baldwin, if you remember, at one point in that essay, paraphrased James Joyce, who in his famous novel, kind of meandering, enormous, sprawling stream of consciousness work from early 20th century Ireland, says, or really a character in that novel says, "History is a nightmare from which I would like to wake up." But history is precisely the nightmare from which we can never awake, because history is not something that we can disentangle from our consciousness or from our present. It in fact constitutes our present, and thus the very ground from which the future and all of the intricate possibilities, many of which are vanishing before our very eyes, can take shape and materialize. And so that's where we find Du Bois in the early 20th century. I consider Du Bois, and I'm not alone in this, of course, but I recognize Du Bois as an exemplar of what has now in academic discourse within philosophy in particular been called Black existentialism. So Du Bois is a kind of Black existentialist, and he asks a question that I think sets that point of discursive sort of purposiveness, like what he's up to, what his project is. It sets it in motion. And that's on the very first page of the first chapter when he asks, how does it feel to be a problem? So how does it feel to be a problem? Now, of course, he's not asking, how does it feel? Oh, I have to let Jordan in, sorry. He's not asking, how does it feel to be a problem, as if he is the cause of some ongoing socio-cultural difficulty, right? For which, that is, he should be blamed or ought to take on some degree of responsibility. So that's not the sense in which he's expressing this notion of problematicity and what it means to be a problem. So this is the existential import of this approach. His very body, as it manifests in space, which turns out to be white neocolonial space, manifests as a problem with or without any particular action that unfolds on the basis of the possibility that his body as a Black body in a white world opens up. So regardless of action, regardless of thought, regardless of choice or decision, his body presents itself in the very space that he occupies and negotiates and attempts haphazardly to understand. He shows up first and foremost as a problem. And so we'll get into that in some detail, but I want to pull up the text and just take some time to work through very carefully together important passages. And at some point, I'll go beyond the first chapter, on which we'll be spending our time and energy to address a second important locus within the text. It comes up in chapter 10, where he gives a different articulation of this concept, double consciousness. And he really only mentions the concept by name a couple times, like a handful of times within this overall body of words. But I think it's of decisive importance. So that's really what we'll be spending most of our time on. But okay, so let me share the screen. And I have, hold on. Okay, let me take off the highlights. Some of you have already annotated the text. I haven't yet read your annotations, but I look forward to that. But let me share the screen and we'll read through the text together. So we'll gain some clarity together and depth with respect to a number of important concepts, double consciousness, the primary one, but relatedly, this image or metaphor of the veil is very important, and that's explicitly referred to much more recurrently than the concept of double consciousness. And then also the color line, or the problem of the color line. So the color line, the veil, and double consciousness. But let's look at the forethought. So I want to, where is it? So this line right here, So he says, leaving then the white world, I have stepped within the veil, raising it that you may view faintly its deeper recesses, the meaning of its religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls. All this I have ended with a tale twice told, but seldom written, and a chapter of song. So leaving then the white world, I have stepped within the veil. So this is the first reference to this elusive notion of the veil. At this point, it's rather enigmatic. Raising it. So he steps within the veil, and his effort here as a writer is to raise that veil, such that we, the reader, may view faintly its deeper recesses. In other words, perhaps what is on the dark side of that veil, the meaning of its religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls. So what exactly is the veil? So what is he talking about, and what does it really mean for us as his readership, that he is stepping within it such that he might raise it and allow us to view faintly its deeper recesses? So what's going on in that? You might say programmatic description. So this account of what he's up to, a justification, in other words, of the project of this book. So what is he saying there? What is the veil? Does anyone have some thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. So the veil would be kind of that societal divide, and the veil cast between the idea of like blackness and whiteness, and that there's, we see them as people, but there's that different dimension beyond that we, as the privileged dominant paradigm, wouldn't necessarily see unless we were to experience. And that's that that two-ness of like the white culture versus black culture and society.
So the veil is what separates those cultural worlds, as it were, or perhaps points of identity, which take shape within the texture of those cultural worlds. So the veil, you might say, so Amanda identified what is on either side of the veil. So let's imagine Du Bois and other Black Americans wearing this veil, donning this veil. And there are various reasons that we can articulate or propose as to why Du Bois uses this particular device, this particular image of a veil. But so let's actually do that. So we have this device of the veil, which is a kind of membrane, you might say, that demarcates or separates different worlds. And now let's spend some time to talk about, so that would be, in a very simplistic way of explanation, the white world and the black world within American society. So what is the veil? So we talked about the worlds separated by the veil. So what then would this veil be? Can anyone maybe propose an answer to that, or try to explore a little bit what it is that constitutes the functional point of separation of these worlds? Is it simply natural? Is it simply that we have white Americans and we have Black Americans? And insofar as we've noted that kind of difference, there are other differences that issue on the basis of the lived experience of these people and so forth. But what is it? Because we might imagine a world in which we have Black Americans and white Americans and Asian Americans and Latino Americans, and a virtual endless range of minute differences that we can articulate, but without having to point out or make sense of this veil. So what exactly is this veil?
I guess I'll take a crack at it. So perhaps this veil is this kind of like a psychological representation of like racial prejudice. So the like um, the material conditions of like the color line and systemic racism leads to this idea of what it is to be white in America or Black in America or Asian in America. And that veil, I guess, colors our perceptions of different people's experiences in America, I guess.
Okay, good. So that's good. Let's think about what a veil is exactly. So if someone is wearing, in a literal sense, if someone's wearing this garment that we label a veil, like what exactly is that? So what kind of contexts do we encounter a veil, and how do they function?
They function as kind of obscuring. And if we're taking it like literally, it's usually worn to things like weddings or funerals, where there's that obscurement of a person's face that you can't exactly see it. Something about something eye of the beholder, and that that what is behind the veil is not necessarily for you to see.
Yeah, so the veil is an obscuring garment, but as a veil, it can't function as such if it entirely obscures, in which case, I mean, there's no real garment like that except if you put like a bag over someone's head, or in moments of like a hostile kidnapping or imprisonment or something. So a veil is interesting in that it obscures but simultaneously reveals. And the obscurity, the degree to which there is an opacity at play is a part of the positive sense in which the revelation is made, right? So that's what like Amanda was talking about in weddings, where the beautiful bride is wearing the veil and the groom, for example, can gaze into her eyes, but through the mediation of this diaphanous sort of fluid fabric, which allows a point of contact, but also maintaining distance through a kind of elusiveness or mystery that's preserved. So the function of a veil is to reveal, but only in an opaque way. So to conceal and reveal at the same time. And so Du Bois wants to, in this work, raise the veil such that we might view faintly its deeper recesses. So in this metaphor, in this kind of analogy dealing with a garment that one wears, who is wearing the veil? So who do you suppose, according to Du Bois, is the one wearing the veil that through this literary gesture, he's going to attempt to mitigate, at least to some extent, the degree of opacity. But as he notes quite clearly, it's not possible, at least yet, to destroy the veil, to remove the veil entirely. That would be to misguidedly and in a complicit sense to pretend that it isn't even there, which some, as he also describes, some Black Americans end up doing insofar as they are pressured into a state of, as Hegel would describe it in Marx, false consciousness. So he talks about that a little bit too. So then who is wearing the veil? Is it everyone in American society? Because he's talking about double consciousness from the point of view of a Black American intellectual, right? So the sense in which his body as a Black body presents itself phenomenologically, that is most impactfully in the first order, in the encounter of his body as a problem. So is it that all Americans are wearing this veil? Or is it only Black Americans, or is it white Americans who are wearing the veil?
I think it's people that I guess well, I think it's in this term be white people, because we're talking about predominantly white and Black people in this context, but because like they are as a general rule kind of looking down to Black people as whatever prejudice they retain, but then also for the Black people they like are where they're being perceived in that way. So but I would say the veil comes primarily from the white perspective.
So is it, I mean, this is a difficult analogy to kind of flesh out. So is it that white people are wearing the veil in the way that one might wear blinders, for example? And so they can only obscurely perceive through that opaque, but only relatively, so diaphanous kind of structure or texture, fabric, however you want to call it? Or is it that Black people are, that is Black Americans, are compelled to wear this veil? And white people, whenever they perceive Black people, they can only see through the mediated conceptual lens, as it were, and that's a different way to explain or to give expression to or illuminate what's going on with the figure of the veil as a kind of lens. So white Americans see Black people, but only on the outside, as a groom might see, for example, a bride who's wearing the veil. But Joshua, so you were suggesting that it's white people that are wearing it, but I don't know. Maybe we can gain some clarity on this as we work through it. But just to lay this out there, I would argue that the veil itself, as this descriptive device, which helps Du Bois give a compelling account of this lived phenomenon of double consciousness, that the veil is precisely the ideology of white supremacy. So it's the ideology of white supremacy that simultaneously obscures the self-presentation or coming into appearance of certain bodies, let's say Black American bodies. But in that obscured presentation, it is also revealing them. It is also disclosing them as meaning some particular thing, as occupying some determinate status or social function or social role. And that's precisely how ideology functions. So for example, in the 20th century, there's a Marxian theorist, Louis Althusser, a French Marxian theorist, who gives us what I think is the most powerful and compelling account of the unfolding and operation of ideology in a book called On Ideology. And a part of this is what he describes as interpolation. So that's a fancy, it's a fancy term. Let me go to the chat, just type that in. So this is the name, Louis Althusser, and his concept. So the book is called On Ideology. And this is a concept of interpolation. And so ideology functions through interpolation. And I have just a passage from that text to share with you. So this is a passage, an excerpt from around the middle of the book. And he has this model of ideology, Althusser, this model of ideology, which is grounded in the operation of interpolation. And a different way to put that is recruitment, or more simply, calling or hailing. So the various agents and institutions and agents that come to operate within these cultural, social, political institutions further expand and entrench a given ideological system or order precisely through efforts of calling and labeling or naming. And so naming and calling have this certain affinity, which is I think expressed in the way people from other countries who speak English use the language. In England, for example, it's much more common than it is in the US for someone to say, I am called Justin, for example, or she is called Thea, or he is called Daniel. And what does that mean as another word for naming, other than when I use the word, when I say Daniel or Alec or Amanda, or when I call your name, I am calling you forth to be present. That is in terms of your consciousness or your attention or your awareness. And so ideology functions in this way. So he says, ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals. And then in parentheses, he says, it recruits them all. So ideology acts or functions in such a way that it recruits subjects among the individuals, or transforms the individuals into subjects. And then also in parentheses, it transforms them all by the very precise operation which I have called interpolation or hailing, and which can be imagined along the lines of the most commonplace everyday police or other hailing. And then he says, as an example, hey, you there. So there's a sense in which subjectivity, and we kind of talked about this in the context of Hegelian, of our discussion of the Hegelian dialectic, the master-slave dialectic. There's a sense in which we are not, so if you recall from Descartes, who bifurcates reality into subjects and objects, minds and material assemblages or bodies. So insofar as we are human consciousnesses, we are human subjects. That is to say, we act in the world, we are in the world. Our identity is anchored by our subjectivity, and subjectivity is the sense in which we we grapple with objects. So objects become conscious to us through perception, through memory, through calculation, measurement, and other modes of preserving the identity of certain things, as in Descartes' example of the ball of wax. So you might conclude from our exploration of Cartesian metaphysics, early modern metaphysics, where we find in the first place the opening up of the distinction between subjects and objects, subjectivity in the sense of the cogito as the foundation for all knowledge. You might expect then that it's the easiest thing in the world to be a subject. There are subjects, you are a subject, and as a subject, you negotiate with objects in the world as well as other subjects, other beings for themselves, to use Hegel's language. And we kind of get this too in the abstract terms in which the master and slave are depicted in their encounter, and the master-slave dialectic in Hegel. So history is, of course, a problem for Hegel. It's a dominant concept in the overarching edifice of his ontology, that is, his account of existence, of what is. But there's something missing in there. So there isn't the lived reality of colonized subjects having to find themselves and um, come to realize and materialize their self-consciousness in a white world. That is to say, a world that doesn't reflect them back to themselves. That specificity of what it means to be a living consciousness in particular historical material conditions was left out, because that's not really, at that point in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the main text in which Hegel lays out his account of the dialectic. That wasn't really the purpose of it. But Althusser's account here is that one's subjectivity, one's personhood, is in an ongoing sense created through this received or inherited sociocultural milieu. So you're not just a subject as you're born, you are constantly subjectivized. So it's through ideology that subjects are created and sustained or transformed into new subjects to be, and this is a connection between these words and concepts, to be subjugated by the dominant perspective or the master class of society, or of an existing social order, as it were. So, and he uses very very helpfully, I think, this image of the police officer hailing someone. So when a cop is policing a neighborhood made up primarily or occupied, inhabited primarily by people of color, the police officer, perhaps a white officer who doesn't live in that community, feels out of place there, goes in with an attitude of anticipating constant threats or something like that, looking for trouble to police. And so this sort of relationship is fleshed out, as it were, in the moment of encounter, when he sees a black body, perhaps behaving from his limited vantage suspiciously. And so the officer will say, "Hey, you there." And suddenly, and that sudden vocal gesture or calling is an act of interpolation, which is one micro contribution or effort towards the overall project of subjectivization, even if the police officer performing the act itself is unaware of this function. So you're a black person just sort of walking down the street, and so a good scenario to explain what's going on here is one that happened a few weeks ago in the freezing conditions, the possibly freezing conditions in Houston, Texas, where people were, not used to -4 degrees. And there was a young man who was leaving work at Walmart, and the weather had changed quite abruptly. And he was forced to walk down the street without much clothing. And he was followed for several blocks by a police officer who was called to come investigate because someone thought that he was suspicious. He was walking in the street rather than the sidewalk because of ice, and he was shuffling around. So the police officer follows him and he's like, "Hey, what are you doing here? Explain yourself." And the guy's like, "Well, I'm coming from work." "Well, why aren't you wearing warmer clothes?" And he's like, "Well, I don't really have warmer clothes." So what's going on in the interaction at a deeper level is a subjectivization. That is, this figure that represents state authority, social and political authority, is calling forth the consciousness of this individual in such a way that he is marked in the calling as a problem, right? And so imagine how differently it is when police officers are explicitly out to recruit, whether at events that are organized for that express purpose, right? To bring in new bodies into their organization. Or if you just see someone walking down the street and you're like, hey, what are you doing? Have you ever thought about being a police officer? Well, you are recruiting them in a different way than the black body in the previous context had been recruited precisely to identify himself or themselves as a problem, right? So that's just to specify what I think is really going on in the image of the veil. The veil is a material and metaphorical construction to exemplify, so material in this metaphorical capacity, to exemplify the interpolating effect, the ideological processes that undergird acts, small and large acts, in social conditions of interpolation, which is subjectivization, creating subjects. And so to a large extent, what Du Bois is analyzing here through a kind of sociological and philosophical lens is the lived experience, that is the lived subjectivity of having, as we'll see when we get to double consciousness, a fragmented self-consciousness, a self-consciousness that never settles into a kind of basic presupposed to be able to do anything, unity or harmony, right? And so we'll come back to the notion of subjectivity and consciousness as presented in the Metaphysics of Descartes to see where the lived reality of consciousness as a Black American remains inexplicable by those abstract universal lights. It's not something that we can adequately unpack or clarify. And so for that reason, we need these new conceptual tools or apparatuses, such as that of double consciousness, to make sense of it. So now let us jump ahead to what it's like, or excuse me, how it feels to be a problem. Let's see, where is it? So let's look at this first paragraph. Between me and the other world, there is ever an unasked question, unasked by some through the feelings of delicacy, by others through the difficulty of rightly framing it. All nevertheless flutter round it. They approach me in a half-hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying it directly, how does it feel to be a problem, they say, I know an excellent colored man in my town, or I fought at Mechanicsville, or do not these southern outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or am interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? I answer seldom a word. And yet, being a problem is a strange experience. So he's trying to give an account for which there is no ready-made vocabulary. He's trying to give an account of what it's like not to have a problem, not to involve oneself in a different problem or the problems of others, but rather to manifest in the ongoing opening up of a social reality specifically as a problem in one's body. And so it's very, I think this is a very important moment in early 20th century academic literature for that reason. And then a little bit down in that paragraph, so let's see. So this is where double consciousness comes in. Then it dawned on me with a certain, well, let's read the first part. So in a wee wooden schoolhouse, something put it into the boys and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards, 10 cents a package, in exchange. The exchange was merry till one girl, a tall newcomer, refused my card. Refused it peremptorily with a glance. Then it dawned on me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like mayhap in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. So there's the second emergence or appearance of this notion of the veil. So shut out from their world by a vast veil. I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil, to creep through. I held all beyond it in common contempt and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. So is it maybe clearer now at this point of the veil, at this point where the concept of the veil is presented, who is wearing it? Does it seem that Du Bois is wearing the veil? And perhaps it had been the case that this veil was always on him, but as a garment that simultaneously and in the same measure conceals and reveals, the veil was really concealing the way that others perceived him. And he only at a particular point of development and adolescence came to be aware that this garment was on him. And that is the recognition that one is in fact, as a body taking up space, occupying that space with other bodies, a problem. And on the basis of that condition, seeing oneself as different than others. But he points out not different in the essential senses of one's humanity, that is in heart and life and longing, but shut out. So the difference is a sort of exclusivity, a sort of blockage. And that's really the function of the veil, this function as a sociological device of white supremacy. And so clearly a sociological device, but also, and this is the philosophical sense, dealing here with metaphysics or ontology. In other words, the metaphysics of personhood. We're dealing with an ideological device that produces subjects through determinate processes, social processes of subjectivization. And so we're seeing here what sociologists refer to as the process of socialization, but is an asymmetrical process of socialization with no promise of unity amongst the subjects who are finding themselves subjectivized through these encounters. But then he says, I had thereafter no desire to tear down that veil. And he comes to that point a couple times in different respects. And he didn't want to creep through it. So after he recognized that he was different, that there is some point of separation and at the same time mediation between himself as a member of the so-called Black world and white society, which is universally identified. And this is another aspect of these processes. White American society is universally identified with Americanism as such. That is the American identity. So to say white American identity would then be, on this basis, a kind of redundancy. And that is precisely a part of this interpolation of the ideology of white supremacy that creates white subjects, that is, those who are comfortable, those who are at home in the white world that they have inherited, whose ongoing social practices sustained by existing cultural institutions reflect or mirror themselves back to them. That is, in the sense of interpolation, as Althusser uses it, call them into it, rather than calling them, to use this way of phrasing it, calling them out of it. Such as the example of police officers, white police officers, policing communities of color of which they themselves are foreigners. So it's a different sort of relationship that we see bodies called forth and come to presence as what they are. All right, so shut off from their world, shut out from their world, excuse me, by a vast veil. And then, let's see. And then after that, he talks about different ways that he encounters perhaps other Black children who, at different points of their own subjective development, come to recognize, of course, not in these explicit terms, that there is some point of separation or demarcation between themselves and other Americans, different ways of dealing with that, different ways of coming to respond to that insight. So with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade. Let's see. I have a printout here. I'm trying to compare texts where I have these texts. I have notes written on my own printout here. Where is it? Ah, here it is. So alas, with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade. So contempt for those on the other side, as it were, of the veil. For the words I longed for, all their dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine. But they should not keep these prizes, I said. Some, all I would wrest from them. Just how I would do it, I could never decide. By reading law, by healing the sick, by telling the wonderful tales that swam in my head, so by becoming a lawyer, and it's worth noting that Du Bois was the first Black person to obtain a PhD from Harvard, right? So he did pursue academic excellence. So reading law, or by becoming a doctor, or by being a literary figure, a writer. With other Black boys, the strife was not so fiercely sunny. Their youth shrunk into tasteless sycophancy. So what is sycophancy? Is anyone familiar with that word? Can anyone define what it means to be a sycophant?
Yeah, it's a person who basically uses flattery to get what they want, kind of situationally, obsequiously acting towards somebody in order to gain an advantage.
Good. So here again, he's characterizing or describing other points of response or efforts to grapple with this elusive divide that separates, from an external objective, you might say, point of view, the white and Black cultural worlds, but then as an internalized point of demarcation, fracture that runs through one's own very sense of self. So this is what he's trying to give an account of for how various responses materialize. So tasteless sycophancy. So gesturing beyond that veil to the white world in a manner of obsequiousness, as Amanda put it. So this effort of subordinating oneself, subjugating oneself to the image that had already unilaterally been used to reduce one's identity or to pin oneself down as, in Hegel's language, a kind of being in itself. That is, a being that has value of use or exchange for a master, that is a being for itself. So then, as is possible within other iterations or examples or points of setup of the master-slave dialectic, this is an effort to pretend that that line doesn't exist, the color line. Or it could be that this response settles into a silent hatred of the pale world about them and mocking distrust of everything white. Or more negatively still, wasted itself in a bitter cry that never gets beyond this kind of despair. So a sort of nihilism. Why did God make me an outcast and a stranger in mine own house? The shades of the prison house closed all around, or closed round about us all, walls straight and stubborn to the widest, but relentlessly narrow, tall, and unscalable to sons of night who must plod darkly on in resignation, or beat unavailing palms against the stone, or steadily, half hopelessly, watch the streak of blue above. So those are ways that he sees others responding to this. So this is the important passage. Let's see. There are two important paragraphs here, but why don't we, before it gets any later at this point, why don't we take just a quick break and then we'll come back. So after 5 minutes or so. So let's take just a quick break and then we'll come back and we'll spend some time on these next paragraphs where double consciousness is given definition and it's connected to this sort of positive power that he describes in the language of a second sight. And so that's a very important moment to grapple with. So we'll come to terms with that, and then we'll work on to other points of the text. And I also want to make some connections to later philosophers of race, post-colonial theorists, such as Frantz Fanon. All right, let's take just a few minutes of a break. I'm going to run to the restroom, and I'll see you guys in just a few minutes. All right, guys. How's everyone doing? Still hanging in there? All right, let's jump back into this. All right. So let's work through this paragraph. So here's where double consciousness emerges explicitly for the first time in the text. After the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Teuton and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil. So it's clear now who wears the veil. Born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So there are a few very interesting things going on in this paragraph, but does anyone have any questions or comments about it? Does anyone want to share an interpretive insight at this point? So I would say the two most important concepts that emerge in this paragraph are, of course, double consciousness, and we've already encountered the image of the veil, but then this notion of second sight is intriguing. So what's going on in this paragraph? What is he talking about? So in what sense would a veil afford one second sight as a gift? So in this sense, described as a kind of superpower, you might say.
Perhaps having the veil means that you have a knowledge of both, and acknowledging that, like, because there is the veil, you see that there is both, and that you can see that there is in fact veil.
Good, good. you put that very well. So at a certain point in the development of one's self-consciousness, one comes to be conscious of the veil in its veiling, similar perhaps to how the denizen of Plato's allegorical cave comes to recognize that he or she in fact exists or lives in a cave, that it's not simply the there or the world in which one finds oneself, that it is a cave that is deliberately, insofar as we're looking at it as a prison in which people are kept, one that is deliberately kept dark and divorced from the goings on of the broader world. So when that prisoner returns to the depths of the cave, they're not able to illuminate it with, say, artificial light. There's already the work being performed by the fire in the course of bringing about and sustaining all of the artificial representations. But all that prisoner can do is give expression to the recognition that he or she and the other prisoners are in fact in a cave. That is revealing the darkness or the hiddenness as darkness and as hiddenness. And so there's something of a power here. So the veil is also an opening. And I mentioned this earlier, that the veil conceals just as it reveals. And noticing that there is concealment or hiding or obscurity in a deliberate sense going on is an important recognition for the potential of breaking through the false consciousness in which perhaps many who are saddled with this kind of subjectivity through these subjectivizing processes never achieve. And so Du Bois talks about those situations as well. But it's a second sight in this American world. So he lists the Negro as a seventh son after these important historical races, you might say, meaning that the Negro, and not simply Africans, right? He's specifically talking about the American Negro. And so the idea of a Negro is really the product of white supremacy. It is the resulting figure of those interpolating historical processes through which different subjects are created. So it's a second sight in a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. So it's a peculiar self-sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity, and then importantly, one ever feels his two-ness, an American and a Negro. So that's the double consciousness, to put it basically at this point of our conversation, consciousness of oneself as a Negro and as an American. And these are two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals that are embodied, that are manifested corporally in one dark body. So unified in the substantial presence of this dark body, but it's a constantly destabilizing unity, which shows up in the fractured consciousness of the racialized subject. So let's talk about that, this double consciousness now. So we'll talk about the sense in which it's a second sight, but it's not necessarily a second sight, right? So it's not as if all Black Americans, so the product of these deliberate historical processes of white supremacy, which function to a large extent by extricating the individual to be so subjectivized in this sort of double consciousness, the Black body, extricating them from the natural history of their originary geographical familiar, that is social relationships, right? So he talks about that too, in which, and also Baldwin in the essay we talked about in connection to Plato's allegory of the cave, they talk about how in the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, the subjects who were being sold as commodities were deliberately untied from their past. So Baldwin makes the very sad, incredibly just weighty, heavy observation that for those of African descent in the United States, who would, as others can do, who have, because of the historical past of their own heritage, been moved around throughout the world, can try to trace one's lineage. Well, when an African American tries to do that, their search for discovery ends at the bill of sale, right? So their basic history has been annihilated. They have been removed, uprooted, you might say, from any historical source or origin, in coming to terms with which they might come to a healthy, robust point of self-consciousness. So so I want to talk about this double consciousness some more in the sense of an embodied experience. So think about, and this is a concept that you might be familiar with from psychology. Is anyone familiar with the concept of the body schema? Has anyone come across that in other classes or in other readings or something? This notion of a body schema. So Amanda, you're familiar with that? Anybody else? So Amanda, what is the body schema, if you don't mind providing an explanation or a description of that?
Yeah, the way I know it, it's considered to the collection of processes that really kind of register where in space your body is, and that like knowledge of where and how your body is.
Exactly. So it's connected to the sense of proprioception too, by the way, as to where one's body is in space, what the contours of that space are with respect to the possibilities of one's body and its extremities, how to negotiate that space in the pursuit of certain objects of desire, and so forth. So earlier I was talking about how we can clarify how the world unfolds from the here of one's body into the there of an overall space in which consciousness is possible, because consciousness is always conscious of something. And it's not, in the first place, consciousness of one's own body. That is a sort of pathological orientation that, in some sense, marks the experience of those in the grip of double consciousness. That is to say, those whose subjectivity is constituted by the apparatus of the ideology of white supremacy, such that it is subjectivized in a particular way. So the body schema, very simply, is an implicit or pre-reflective, so it's nothing that you're thinking of self-consciously. When you are, there's a problem, right? So it is an implicit or a pre-reflective sense of your own body's embodiment, your own body's locatedness in space, and how that body is capable of reaching out into space towards or from other bodies and going about realizing expectations or desires. And so how the body schema typically functions is it's such that your own body is not an object that you encounter in the first order, but your own body is rather a condition for the possibility of such encounters, such that your body under typical normal conditions is oriented in space, from a kind of unity which disappears or withdraws behind meaningful action. So, for example, without thinking of it, I have in mind, or that's a contradiction, excuse me, without thinking of it, I have a kind of desire to take a sip of coffee. So I extend my arm and I know exactly, without having to measure, without having to calculate or size up, what I'm going to do in a step-by-step manner. I extend my arm knowing more or less precisely how to do it without even having to size up the object towards which I'm extending my arm. I reach out, I grab it, and then I bring it to my face to take a sip. So there has to be a functional body schema that, as a picture of what my body is and how it can achieve its ends, withdraws or disappears from explicit presentation. So if I was painfully aware of my body as this point of origin, as this possibility for experience, then in some sense I could never reach the coffee cup, because the very act through which I pursue an attempt to make real or to actualize my desire would be interrupted. So to get along in the world, our bodies withdraw behind our purposeful actions. They are never in the front, except when something goes wrong, right? So if you're jogging or something and then your ankle lands in the wrong way, you roll your ankle, well, now suddenly brought to explicit attention or conscious awareness is your ankle, when previously to do the work of your ankle, to support the weight of your body as it's moving through space, the articulation of different muscles, your ankle has to kind of disappear from view. But when you roll it, it's suddenly there. It's suddenly brought in a forceful and literally painful way to the immediacy of your attention. So under normal circumstances, the way our body orients itself to objects in space is such that it's always implicitly in the background. So now I want to, and this is, I think, a very powerful way to exemplify Du Boisian double consciousness. So I'm drawing from Frantz Fanon's famous book from the early 1950s, Black Skin, White Masks. So Frantz Fanon is a post-colonial theorist and also a radical activist against racial oppression from Martinique, so as a French colony in the Caribbean. But he was also a psychiatrist, by the way, in addition to being a post-colonial theorist, a kind of philosopher and a Black existentialist, I would say. But he gives this account of a perfectly mundane situation that wouldn't strike one as anything particularly philosophically interesting. So he says, the image of one's body is solely negating. It's an image in the third person. All around the body reigns an atmosphere of certain uncertainty. I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to stretch out my right arm and grab the pack of cigarettes lying at the end of the table. As for the matches, they are in the left drawer, and I shall have to move back a little. And I make all these moves not out of habit, but by implicit knowledge. A slow construction of myself as a body in a spatial and temporal world. So that is the body schema right there. A slow construction of myself as a body in a spatial and temporal world. Such seems to be the schema. It is not imposed on me. It is rather a definite structuring of myself and the world. A definitive, structuring of myself and the world. Definitive because it creates a genuine dialectic between my body and the world. So he's giving a picture here of how the body schema functions under ordinary circumstances of self-consciousness. That is, to act, one's body as the locus for action disappears as a thematic object of self-consciousness in order to perform perfectly banal actions with which we're all familiar. But what happens when we're dealing with a black body within, in Fanon's case, a colonial world, that is a world that is marked by the ideology of whiteness, in which white bodies disappear, that is, they find themselves at home, they're quite comfortable, but the black bodies, and so this is fairly different, of course, than the situation in which we find African Americans, but black bodies as the indigenous people of these colonized spaces come to grow into, and there's a connection here, the kind of veil that Du Bois is talking about, where they don't see themselves manifested in the spaces that their bodies come to occupy. But rather they see themselves thrown back at themselves as at odds. And so how does this materialize in the pursuit of basic everyday bodily functions in the realization of one's ordinary desires, such as the desire to grab a cup of coffee or to pick up a pack of cigarettes to enjoy a smoke? Well, imagine Fanon here, or another black body in a situation where they're sitting at a table with a bunch of white people, perhaps white people that they don't know. Well, now, whereas under ordinary circumstances, I would just get up and grab my cup of coffee, or in Fanon's example, just reach across several other persons sitting at the same table to grasp the object that I want, in this case, a pack of cigarettes. My body is all the while withdrawing behind the purposeful deployment of the desire. But in Fanon's case, he has to think of himself first as a black body. His motions become calculated insofar as they are now perceived not only liminally from the originary point of emergence into the world as a subjectivity, but from the point of view of the objectivized other, in this case, the white gaze. So now the black body who wants to grab the pack of cigarettes to enjoy a smoke has to think about how his body is going to appear to those white eyes at the table. He can't move too quickly. Perhaps he'll be perceived as a kind of threat. Maybe he'll be suspected of being up to some kind of violence, or even if there's no direct interpretation on the part of the white sitting at the table as to what this individual might be doing that's at odds with his actual purpose, the black body still has to think of how he's being perceived, right? So we're dealing here with an interruption of the typical body schema. And notice that this isn't this scenario or vignette that Fanon shares with us to give a sense of this reality. It's nothing particularly strange or significant, right? It's just someone sitting at a table with others trying to reach for a pack of cigarettes. So this kind of experience in the case of double consciousness marks the possibility of all bodily experience within the social space in which one finds oneself, in which that veil would be at work. And so then he goes on, he says, beneath the body schema, and notice though that the body schema, he says, isn't imposed upon him. So this is the sense in which one's self as a body and one's awareness as a body in space, and not only as a body, but as desire, which can be achieved through bodily motion and gesture. That's nothing imposed on one. It develops naturally through interaction, through becoming who one is in a given space. But then he says, beneath the body schema, I had created a historical racial schema. So the body schema, as phenomenologists have studied it, and phenomenology is an area of 20th century philosophy that investigates the nature of appearances. So how things appear to us, how as subjects of self-consciousness we're able to pick up on and relate to things, which through what Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, calls the natural attitude, we say are these sort of existing physical objects. But leaving all those assumptions aside, just taking it in, how things typically appear to us and how we make sense of these appearances. The body schema is fundamental, right? So the world unfolds here at the place of my body, but it's not a precisely localized consciousness. That is to say, and this is the sense of the body schema, that, so for example, in my own case, I'm sitting here at my desk, I'm not looking behind me, but I have a liminal, that is unconscious understanding of what is behind me. So if I desire a book, I know perhaps more or less where it is, how to reach for it, and so forth. And I also have a liminal sense, without any direct perception, of what's going on in the hallway beyond my office. So I know my colleague is a couple doors down right now, engaged in her own class, and that if I were to make a series of typical motions through my door down the hallway, I could encounter and have a conversation. So all of that knowledge, a kind of implicit knowledge, as Fanon puts it, is predicated on this pre-reflective, really corporeal, firm, embodied understanding of my own body and space. But Fanon's point is that for the Black body, and this is where we get double consciousness, there is something more fundamental at work, even below the body schema. And that's what he identifies or labels here as the historical racial schema. And that is a historical racial schema, and this is the sense with which I began the class, with the Joyce quote by way of Baldwin, that history is a nightmare from which I would like to awake. This historical racial schema is what one has inherited, the veil, in other words, that one has inherited and that marks one's Black body from all external vantage points, from the very point of one's coming into being in the world. But it's only at a certain moment in experience in adolescence, for example, as Du Bois describes the scene of sharing cards with other students, that this self-consciousness becomes concrete. So then below the body schema is this historical racial schema, which is constantly interrupting the typical function of the body schema, such that one sees oneself as a Negro. And the Negro, again, is the product of white supremacy, a model of which, or a physical kind of image that represents which, would be the veil. When one wants to do anything, especially when surrounded by white bodies as a Black body, one has to see oneself, first of all, as a body, and then through that kind of abstract mediation, perform one's originary, that is impulsive, subjective acts of desire. And so then, if the racial schema, as Fanon puts it, is beneath, is deeper than, is below the body schema, for Black bodies in particular occupying, let's say, white worlds, then the historical racial schema defines and constructs the very conditions and terms through which the body schema is able to operate. So then the historical racial schema modifies the functioning of the body schema. It defines the conditions of its own operation. And so one sees oneself simultaneously as Black and an American. And so these are points of identity then that stand in conflict. And so we can all maybe share examples of various points of identity that make up our personhood, that qualify in an ongoing way, that can be transformed, for example, that qualify our sense of self-consciousness. So, for example, in my own case, I identify as a man, as a professor, racially. I know I'm white. I am a first generation college student. I am a musician. I am a veteran. So I have all these points of identity by which I come to be conscious of my own self. But none of these points of identity stand in fundamental tension or contradiction with one another. They are fundamentally reconcilable. As an example of ordinary consciousness, then, this exemplifies the Cartesian subject. So if you remember, now going back to Hume, Hume's criticism of the Cartesian ego as the model of personal identity or selfhood. What did Hume say about that? So he's specifically criticizing or attacking the notion of the soul as the principle of identity. What characteristics define the soul in this role? Well, the soul is unified and the soul is simple, right? So those are the terms that Hume inherited, that he was responding to as the typical ways in the history of Western thought that we have come to understand personal identity. And so that's why he's challenging this idea. So the soul as consciousness is unified and simple. Whereas the body, remember, what defines the body in contradistinction to the soul is its material divisibility. So for Descartes, you can, through horrible accidents, lose all of your fingers or perhaps entire limbs and still remain the person that you are, because the person that you are is defined by your subjectivity or consciousness. But what Du Bois is talking about here in terms of double consciousness is the experience of the American Black person as marked by a fragmentary condition, such that it never settles into a satisfying unity on the basis of which one can deploy one's actions with useful confidence in the world. So then, does that make sense so far? Are there any comments or questions about that? So Du Bois is giving us then this account of the way in which social contradiction, so here's the contradiction between identities that one comes to inherit, that one comes to grow into, the identities of being an American and the identity of being Black. There is a irreparable tension between them that one has to live as a Black body in a white space. So then this social contradiction, Du Bois is arguing, becomes the very ground for the possibility of a lived existence, which stands at odds with the Cartesian picture of ordinary consciousness or subjectivity. And so the tension is, as an American, Americanism is exemplified by characteristics or predicates that have been associated with whiteness. So this is the sense in which the idea of white American is a kind of redundancy, right? It's an unnecessary repetition. So then the Black American is supposed to, at the very same time, be American, but is also marked as different. And so these can't be reconciled. And it's not as if Du Bois wants to make a choice, right? So he says he would not Africanize America, for America has too much to teach the world in Africa. So there's something good about American culture that ought to be preserved, that has something to teach the world. But then he says he would not bleach his Negro soul in a flood of white Americanism, for he knows that Negro blood has a message for the world. So he doesn't simply want to artificially disrupt or destroy this bifurcation, which would be a kind of problematic assimilation, right? So there's the rub. There is, for good reason, the desire to preserve both identities, but in that preservation, the lived experience in terms of one's self-consciousness is marked by a kind of overwhelming anxiety, right? Where one is, as an internal sort of process of coming to know oneself and to act in the world with others, one is constantly at odds with oneself. Okay. So does that make sense so far? This idea of double consciousness?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So yeah, we'll continue with this next time before transitioning to a discussion of the short story, the comment, which is really just a way of illuminating in a powerful sort of narrative way what's going on in this theoretical explanation or account of double consciousness in particular. So it's a really great story, and I look forward to the presentation for Thursday, and I look forward to hearing what you guys have to share about your experience reading it. And we'll just continue basically this discussion that we started today. So are there any final comments or questions about this? Oh, sorry, I noticed there's stuff going on in the chat. Yeah, code switching. So that's something that we'll talk about too. I intended to bring that up. So thanks, Amanda. And then, yeah, the standard being white. Okay, cool. So yeah, thanks guys. I hope you guys are doing okay. And I'll see you on Thursday. So take care.
Sorry, that was talking. I said, do you prefer Professor Harmon or being called Justin?
I don't care.
Okay.
It's
I know
whatever.
Dr. Shapiro is very particular of Dr. Shapiro.
I'm happy with Dr. Harmon, Professor Harmon,
Okay.
or Justin. I typically don't like Mr. Harmon very much, but
Yeah,
Justin's cool. I don't mind that.
cool. Basically, just real quickly, I'm successful in being current the last 2 weeks. So I've done my discussions, I've done the reflection, I've done the quiz. Same thing for all my classes. I fell way behind during my kind of rough patch, but my goal is to be current and then slowly chip away at the things in the past. And so I've remained, it might be week 3 that I've been current. So I'm staying present with the class, I'm staying current. So I'm working on those past things. And so I'm gonna be doing some of the discussions I missed. I think I only missed discussions. I think I need 2 quizzes reopened. Maybe quiz 5. I have it written down. I'll send you an email.
Okay,
So I just
yeah.
want to let you know that I'm current, staying current for the rest of the term, and then pick up the rest of the stuff as I go along over the next, I guess, 2 weeks. So
Okay,
that's my
great.
plan.
Yeah, so just send me an email and I can open up those quizzes
Awesome.
for you.
Will do.
All right, cool.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Harmon.